unmute myself. Hello, and thank you for joining us at the third Climate Crisis Advisory Group public meeting. Now, those of you who are regular viewers to the Climate Crisis Advisory Group live streams may notice that I'm not in my office that I normally would be at. I'm actually at the Tokyo Paralympics. I've just watched in equestrian, GB and Brazil win gold medals, and Australia are at the top of the medals table. So congratulations to all of those nations. It's an absolute honor to be here at the Paralympics, but it's also an honor to be hosting the CCAG live streams, and that's why I think it's so important to be doing this. So if you are joining us for the first time, well, CCAG was recently formed as a new advisory group to help to help inform the public, governments and financial institutions, providing them with the most comprehensive science and, more crucially, guidance towards action for climate repair. Now, this month, the group will be looking at the implications of the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's AR6 report and the urgent actions that must follow from its findings. CCAG's last report, the Final Warning Bell report, written by members this month, commends the Ipcc for its assessment of the current climate emergency and agrees that there has never been so much scientific evidence to explain the severity of the climate catastrophe that we are all now facing. However, CCAG believes that we need to go one step further, and the findings must now be supported by serious action to repair the damage already caused to our planet. And crucially, the time to start is now. If you'd like to read the full report and its recommendations, the link to download it is available on CCAG's Twitter at Climate Crisis AG and the CCAG website, ccag.earth. Now I'm going to pass over to Professor Nerily Abraham, Sir David King, and Dr. Fatima Denton to talk us through the findings in the new report. So firstly, Nerily, over to you.
Thank you, Ade. And I think we've got some slides about to be shown. Right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. So our report this month follows the release of the IPCC's 6th assessment report a couple of weeks ago. This report has been described by the IPCC as a code red for humanity. It's no exaggeration to say that this IPCC report is the most important climate report ever written. Its warnings are stark and unambiguous. Every tonne of carbon dioxide that we emit does damage to the climate system we depend upon. Every fraction of a degree of further warming places humanity at greater risk. We at the Climate Crisis Advisory Group commend the IPCC and all of the authors involved for their unflinching assessment of the catastrophe we face if immediate action isn't taken. We commend them for the clarity with which they've synthesized many thousands of pieces of scientific evidence to clearly illustrate the future risks that lie ahead. Never before have we had so much undeniable evidence for the global climate emergency. The priority conclusions from the IPCC 6th assessment report are that the human influence is pervasive and undeniable, with at least 1.5 degrees of warming cemented into the future alongside irreversible sea level rise. All additional greenhouse gas emissions will increase the risks we face from extreme weather events and the likelihood of passing irreversible tipping points. Our actions in the next 9 years will determine the climate impacts for future generations for centuries to come. This report is clear that the current shift in global emissions is not sufficient. There is no carbon budget remaining for humanity to burn. If we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we have less than 500 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions left to burn. At current rates of global emissions, that gives us just 10 years.
Wow.
But it's actually even worse than that. That is the budget for a 50-50 chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Those types of odds are not good enough when we're gambling with the livability of our planet. In the lead up to COP26 in under 2 months' time, it's critical that global ambition to tackle climate change ramps up. The world needs to achieve net zero by 2050, and developed countries need to achieve net zero even earlier to create space for others. But the conversation needs to go even further. This diagram on the next slide illustrates the scale of the task ahead. The black curve illustrates historical emissions. Despite more than 30 years of warning from IPCC reports, despite the Paris Agreement, despite all the talk that we hear around emission reductions and net zero, global emissions have continued increasing year on year. We are not following a rapidly reducing emissions pathway that would put us on track for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. In the last year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced a temporary reduction in emissions, but this is already being reversed as restrictions ease around the world. This temporary reduction from the huge societal disruption of the pandemic also emphasises the scale of emission reductions that are needed. We need to maintain that level of emission reductions and add the same to it again each year, every year, to make that transition of avoiding dangerous climate change. For every year that we delay beginning those transformational emission reductions, we force the necessary emission reductions to be even faster, with net zero achieved well before 2050. But net zero isn't where this ends. Once we achieve net zero, we need to continue to go even further so that each year we draw more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than we add to it. The technological challenge of this can't be understated. This is why the Climate Crisis Advisory Group is emphasising the need not just for fast and determined progress on emission reductions, but also the need for urgent greenhouse gas removal. Removal is not part of the common narrative for climate change action, but at COP26, it needs to be. And I'll pass over now to Sadave.
Thank you very much, Nerily. I'm going to then kick off by saying that what we urgently need now is a systemic global strategy to create a manageable future for humanity. Yes, of course, we need processes such as adaptation. Sea levels are rising. We need to defend ourselves against flooding. But we are now talking, when we talk about a strategy, we're talking about actions that would return the Earth to a manageable state for the future. And what this means is that we need our full 3R strategy. This is reduce emissions as rapidly as possible, remove greenhouse gases that are in excess in the atmosphere already, and also repair those parts of the climate system, such as the North Pole region, where a tipping point appears to have already passed. And so we need all three elements: reduce, remove, repair. Let me just talk about greenhouse gas removal in a little more detail. Net zero greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide emissions targets are, as we know, already in place for about 70% of the global economy over a range of different timescales. Now, this is an important starting point for climate repair because nobody's going to get to net zero without having reduced emissions. You won't get to absolute zero emissions. And that's why the phrase net zero is used. So what we must combine deep and rapid emissions reduction with is the speedy expansion of carbon sinks to create negative growth of atmospheric greenhouse gases, as Nerily was saying. Net zero is insufficient. Net negative emissions is required. Now, there is a pressing need for public finance to fund the research and development needed to achieve scalable greenhouse gas sinks. And so one of the questions that we need to ask is, how do we achieve the public finance that is necessary? Let me remind people that Mission Innovation was created on the first day of COP21 in Paris, not part of the official process. We simply invited countries that would be committed to raising a total of $30 billion a year of public money to be spent on research and development to create all of the technologies required in the post-fossil fuel world. And 22 countries stood under the banner and made that commitment. That number is now 25 countries, representing probably about 80% of the world's GDP. These countries together are now approaching that initial target of $30 billion a year, but they've agreed to increase the target now by 2025 to $40 to $45 billion a year. Now, let me make a plea here. This research into carbon removal is not taking place at anything like the scale required to manage the problem. Can we please have Mission Innovation commit itself to spending a significant proportion of that $40 to $45 billion by 2025 on the business of greenhouse gas removal from the atmosphere? Each pillar of the strategy I've named is necessary. So we do need reduction. We do need removing excess greenhouse gases, and we also need repair to buy time, because the other two processes really are going to take quite a long time. We believe we need to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to create a manageable future down to about 350 parts per million from the current, and let's add methane in, often forgotten, from the current about 500 parts per million to about 350 parts per million, and it'll take us to the end of the century. So there is a fourth element we want to add, and that is we will have to promote agile political and financial responses now to manage this problem. Now, let's look at the strategies for removing, let's say, 30 to 40 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. What this means is that we need to focus on only those technologies that are capable of removing in excess of, let's say, 1 billion tons a year. So when we add up all of these processes, we get to the required 30 to 40 billion tons a year. Now, cost of running these is also a consideration, as is public engagement, so as to create a social mandate for large-scale technological intervention in so-called natural systems. So-called because we have been ourselves wrecking many of those natural systems. Now, the technical greenhouse gas removal solutions include capturing carbon dioxide in particular at the point of emission. So in our production of concrete and steel, for example, it wouldn't take an awful lot to capture all of the carbon dioxide emitted from these processes and then to sequester the product or to use the carbon dioxide to create a financial rewarding process. But now we need also removal of excess greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and here's where so-called direct air capture is making some progress in some parts of the world. Now, these technologies appear very expensive, probably costing $200 to $500 per ton of carbon dioxide captured. And this involves pulling carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases directly from the air for sequestration. More complex technologies are required for methane capture or methane oxidation as well. Nature-based solutions include land-based solutions. What we need to acknowledge is what the AR6 report tells us, that today the land sector, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors contribute about 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, this isn't a problem that rests alone with the energy sector. It is heavily a land-based sector as well that is creating these emissions. And AR6 highlights the critical role of natural sinks in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also points out that, for example, the Amazon is already reaching a behavior where rather than acting as an overall sink of carbon dioxide, it is actually a net emitter of carbon dioxide at the moment. So what we need is a range of policies. Let's move on from land-based policies to policies based on the oceans. The oceans are 72% of the Earth's surface. So let's not forget the oceans in our work. Processes such as marine upwelling, bringing nutrients up from the floor of the ocean in coastal areas, extends the development of marine kelp, seagrasses, seaweed farms, etc., offering new carbon sinks and food, for example, for cattle, but also for human beings. And so we go to another technique, which is oceanine fertilization, which is a controversial subject. What we need in all of these cases is trials that are already being launched for the careful monitoring of any adverse impacts of ocean fertilization, such as the creation of anoxic zones in the ocean. So what we need is, again, extensive, careful research before these techniques are rolled out to scale. But certainly one of the advantages of oceanine fertilization, where we can do the process using desert dust or volcanic dust, natural materials available contain enough iron and other minerals that are really helpful to the whole process. What we find, of course, is that wherever this is done, we create ocean forests, and within months, those forests are teeming with marine biodiversity, with both fish and whales at scale. So I just run forward rather quickly now. An important consideration of any greenhouse gas removal approach is the impact on land and local populations. We must always be sensitive to what local people are thinking, and in particular, we need to highlight the importance of both equity and the defense of the rights of indigenous people and traditional communities in different parts of the world. Now, I think I do want to emphasize the overlap with biological diversity, and there is a convention, COP15, on the Convention of Biological Diversity, which will be held in October 2021 in Kunming in China. And this, I believe, offers a very important opportunity to deepen the link between climate and biodiversity. And at that point, I'll leave you and pass you on to, I think.
So we'll pass on to Dr. Fatima Denton to finish off this month's climate report.
Thank you, Ade.
Thank you very much. I think Sir David has covered some part of the equity implications in the report. Let me just say that equity is an important factor to consider. We do want to get the transition right, but we don't want to do it at the expense of climate justice. Neither do we want to do it at the expense of, people who are already bearing a huge part of the climate related impacts, the negative impacts of climate change. So I think collective action, the report emphasizes that collective action is going to be necessary. But we also have to recognize that there are aspects related to agency, related to capacity, and related to resources that might mean that we're not all at the same starting points. And that's something to recognize. If you take, for instance, the report makes reference to this, when you consider the continent of Africa, it's already in a very vulnerable position. And it's vulnerable because it also doesn't have the required adaptive capacity to manage climate impacts. Most climate scientists will tell you that climate observations matter. You need to be able to observe, both historical and current data so that you can at least be in a position to plan. The problem we have is that for Africa, most African countries do not have the requisite observational infrastructure that would enable them to be able to plan ahead. And this has direct implications for the agricultural productivity. This is a continent where 70% of the population rely on agriculture, and where 30% of the GDP from Africa is directly related to agriculture. So to be able to plan ahead, you do need to have reliable and quality climate data. And if you don't have the relevant infrastructure, if you don't have the relevant data and coverage, then this would have an impact in terms of how you may be able to support your agricultural sector. So that's just one area. I think beyond that, it's important also to note that some of the areas where we're going to have to make deep cuts, like in the energy sector, in the transport sector, are also areas where many countries in the developing world are struggling. You have over 600 million people in Africa that do not have access to clean energy services. So I think there is a sense that, yes, mitigation is possible, but it's also important perhaps to identify regions that may be able to afford deep mitigations, faster mitigations, and to incentivize those regions. Because without that, I think it would be a lot more difficult, especially when you add issues around population size. And obviously Africa is growing and growing rapidly. So these are all aspects, I think, that we have to look at very carefully. The energy sector is an enabler, but at the same time, it does pose quite a number of threats. One other area that I also mentioned, which is related to the energy sector and that has equity implications. If we're going to decouple fossil fuel from economic growth, it does mean that we will have to leave a lot of hydrocarbon resources in the ground. This has implications also for countries who are reliant on fossil fuel as their main revenue stream. And you have countries that are producing oil and gas or are new producers of oil and gas and do rely on these as their main revenue stream. So we have to be able to find alternative ways of diversifying the economies of those countries or supporting them in their diversification process. And we have to also make it known that, for a long-term sustainable development, they may be headed towards a blind alley, that even if they're able to take advantage of their hydrocarbon resources, that these resources may become stranded. And once they become stranded, it will not be a very profitable sort of economic enterprise for these countries. So we do need to, unlock a lot of the finance-related problems, which are huge problems when we talk about climate change, but we do need to unlock some of these difficulties to be able to enable countries to arrive at a faster mitigation, because at the moment, mitigation is possible for all countries, but to be able to incentivize some countries, they do need some of the major transitional drivers. Infrastructure is one, knowledge is another, the capacity to be able to do it, but also I would say resources is a key element. So these are all, I would say, aspects that would enable the deployment of technology, because we do need to deploy technology at a faster rate than we are doing currently, but we also do need to incentivize economies that are in the front line and are going to be hugely impacted by climate impacts. So that's what I'll say for now to complement some of what others have said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Neralisa Dave and Dr. Fatima, for that comprehensive overview. Okay, it's now your turn to get involved, and it's time to open up the floor to questions from members of the media and public. Now, once again, we've got a lot of questions to get through, so please be as concise as possible. So our first question comes from Josephine Latoussaint, Strategic Comms Expert for Global Development.
Great, thank you. Is my microphone working?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Hi. Yes, my name is Josephine, and thank you for all the wonderful presentations that were being made today. I guess my question, coming from a communications perspective, and especially on the first presentation, related to the first presentation, we've seen a lot of coverage on the Ipcc report on the media, BBC, CNN, and a lot of it really is taking that kind of apocalyptic angle. It's code red. This is the last chance we have to make a difference. And while there is definitely an urgency that we have to heed there, what do you think are other narratives that could help also, aside from this one, because this is the dominant one related to this report. But as we've just seen today from the speakers, there's so much more within the report in terms of the technical solutions, the gaps, the equity issues. What are some narratives that you think should the media also be focusing on, and what stories also need to be told more, in your opinion? Thank you.
Very good question. And I can see Lorraine Whitmarsh has her hand up there. So why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I think this is a really important issue because it is, I think, about balancing this sense of urgency, this sense that really we absolutely have to be taking action and that there are real risks at play here, with a sense of efficacy, that there's still things that we can do, and many of these things will afford us a range of benefits as well and improve our well-being. We know that in the absence of that latter half, if we don't sort of convey something positive in a sense that we can make a difference, there is a risk that people switch off, that people think this is just too much to take in, and they kind of maybe move into denial mode, or they just ignore the message altogether. And so I think we do need to be pairing it up with those more positive narratives. There's a lot of research that's been done on how to communicate climate change effectively and what narratives work. Some of those narratives work with certain audiences and not others, and it kind of depends on the values that audience has. So the evidence suggests that, for example, like words like climate emergency, they do work to engage some audiences, but they switch off others. Similarly, equity, justice works with some, whereas more kind of economic narratives work with others. Some of the ones which seem to work across audiences include how ordinary people can work together to make a difference. And actually, that's really resonating, particularly in light of COVID, where a lot of communities have come together, to help one another and to make a difference. So I think giving people real examples that they can relate to, I think really helps with that, showing that there are social benefits, social co-benefits, and other wider co-benefits of climate action can really help motivate people as well.
Thank you, Professor Whitmarsh. I can see Dr. Aranaba has got his hand up as well.
Thank you for that question. I think this is something that we all grapple with, and none of us has the great answer, has the best answers. But it's evident that what we need to do is we have to ensure that we shift from the sensational to the strategic. And this is not at all to suggest that what the Ipcc and others are saying is sensational, but there is a risk that if the headlines are captured only for a few days, then that critical message that is being delivered will be treated as sensational. And then we'll move on in the news cycle to the next sensational thing, and on and on and on, till 4 or 5 or 6 years later, another report comes out and says how bad things are. Now, how can we move from the sensational to the strategic? One, of course, we have to internalize the science, and a conversation like we're having today, we need to have many more of them, because of course the Ipcc has a role, but then many other bodies have a role, including curriculum, including the pedagogy that we follow in schools and universities, where climate change or environmental damage is not just something that environmental sciences students are dealing with, but it's something that is embedded across everything that we are talking about. That's one issue, of course, and that applies even to the briefings that are given at the highest levels of government. There should be, just like national security briefings, there should be climate emergency briefings on a regular level to the highest levels of government. Now, each government can decide what that periodicity should be, but there should be a process that each country determines for itself in how its decision makers gets a sense of it. The second important thing that has to happen in moving towards the strategic is understanding not just what the science says, but what the politics delivers. And here it is important to start highlighting not just the challenges of getting nearly 200 countries to cooperate and collaborate and reduce and remove emissions, but where are the political benefits? Say even at a local level, at a mayoral level, at a chief minister or governor level, where political leaders are deriving the political benefits for becoming climate leaders as well, right? And the more we highlight that, you realize that aligning your political strategy to responding to the climate crisis can be something, not in every case, can in fact be very high risk for certain individuals, but at the same time, there are ways in which you can communicate that the climate vulnerable and the interests of those who have their interests embedded in the existing economic ecosystem can be converged in one way or the other. And finally, we have to look at what the economy demands. And this goes back to what Lorraine was also just mentioning. We have to ask ourselves a very simple question. Is there a sunrise sector in the global economy or in the emerging economies, the developed economies, which is not low carbon? And we could argue, yes, space tourism is not low carbon. We could argue that seabed mining is not low carbon. But generally, we will struggle to find economic sectors that promise high growth in future that are unlikely to be not on a sustainable pathway. And if we arrive at that decision, then the question becomes, how soon can I get onto that pathway, either as a city, as a state, or a country? So the climate science is, of course, saying something. But beyond that, we need to also look at what the politics delivers and what the economy demands to move from the sensational to the strategic.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I can see there are more hands up to answer this question, but we've got so many questions to get through. So I'm going to move on, and I hope, Josephine, that you felt your question was answered there. So our next question comes from Nyombi Morris, youth climate activist and ambassador for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Over to you, Nyombi.
Okay, can you hear me? Is my mic on?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I just want to ask one question based on Africa. Professor Fatima was talking about it. So like Africa contributes the least when it comes to global warming. But as I'm talking right now, climate change burden in Africa is greater compared to other continents. Climate change is undoing our development, displacing people, and also stressing our weak economy. It has led to an increase in human suffering, and we are running out of resources like water and food. As youth based in Africa, what do you think we can do to solve this issue?
Thank you, Nyombi. That was a very, very important question. Who out of our team would like to answer that question?
I can respond very quickly, Ade, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much for that question. I mean, I think it's not just what youth can do. I would say it's more or less a collective action that is needed. Different stakeholders need to do different things. I think that sometimes the impression is that maybe Africa is not doing enough. And things have been done, but they're often very marginal, or maybe they're very fragmented. Let me say they're fragmented. Take the example of the Great Green Wall. This is an initiative that is being promoted in terms of the restoration of land. It's a very important initiative, and if it's done properly with the relevant support, it would also help in terms of managing adaptation, avoiding new emissions, because in actual fact, the emissions, like you said, in Africa are quite low. It's less than 5%. So what you need here is more of avoidance of emissions. So you need to really make a concerted effort to avoid emissions rather than the reduction of emissions, although we know we have to do both because land-based emissions are growing in Africa. So I would say combination of things need to be done. We need to find ways of incentivizing agriculture because, this is an area where most youth do not want to get into because it doesn't seem lucrative enough. It doesn't seem sexy enough. So I would say efforts need to go into that area. But I would also say that some of the nature-based solution that we talked about, also we have to ramp up efforts in terms of nature-based solutions so that we can support the African youth. I think at the last count, there was over 11 million sort of Africans that were going into the labor force every year, and obviously there are issues around unemployment in Africa. And these are all going to be, big challenges ahead, not to mention some of the other structural problems that we have with energy poverty, with debt burden, and all of those things. So that's why I would say that although climate change is a major issue that all nations have to deal with, I would feel that there would be more efforts need to be made by the developed world, but also by African countries themselves. To start really investing in the sectors that matter. And energy sector is one of them, agricultural sector is another one. And maybe more effort also needs to be made in terms of managing, I would say, our urban cities, which is also another big problem. So these are all areas where collective efforts are needed, but I don't necessarily see it as one government, just one government doing something. I see it as a collective action that everybody needs to do something, and changes at the margins are not going to be enough. We need deeper, wider, bolder actions to be able to get there.
Thank you, Dr. Denton. I can see Professor Rockstrom has got his hand up. Would you like to take this question on?
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly building on Fatima's point and connecting to Arunaba, actually, because I think it's really important, Nyombi, to now hold two thoughts in the air at the same time when it comes to the African development over this coming decade. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. There's a huge planetary injustice in the fact that African nations, the poor, vulnerable communities across the world, are the primary victims for a crisis that is not caused by those communities. So that is something that actually raises the argument for compensation, and there's a lot of discussions on that, as you may know, in the climate negotiations. And I think African nations must and should keep that argument really alive, not least given that today the Nature journal released another paper showing how African nature carbon sinks are much more important than we previously thought. So African communities and African continent is providing a global common to climate stability, which is so far underestimated. But at the same time, I think it's really important to take what Arunaba pointed out at heart, that this is the opportunity for Africa to leapfrog. There's so much evidence that a zero carbon future is a much more job-creating, economic, secure, healthy, modern future. You don't want to get stuck in another generation of lagging behind because of investing in the kind of the past generations' black fossil fuel-based economic development. So somehow one has to address the planetary injustice, but at the same time move really fast towards a zero carbon future, for the simple reason of competitiveness and good life quality. So I think there is something really important here for youth and for policy in Africa.
Yeah, fantastic answer. I do agree with you. I think Africa has got the potential to lead the way in clean energy. I was in Cape Verde not long ago and saw what they were doing with wind and water power there and solar power. So there is the potential to lead. Nyombi, thank you for that really important question. And I hope you were satisfied with the answers. We're going to move on now to Mitzi Janelle Tan, convener and international spokesperson for Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines and the Philippines Friday for Future group. Mitzi, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Mitzi, a climate justice activist from the Philippines, where we have seen the highest number of extreme weather events in the past 20 years. The Ipcc report doesn't really tell us anything new. It just reminds us that people, activists, and scientists will have already been saying before that the climate crisis is here and it's getting worse because of business as usual and the fixation of the global north on everlasting growth and the overexploitation of the global south. So with the latest report, though, we have seen this new sense of urgency, it being called code red in media and it blowing up a little bit on social media and on mainstream news. So my question is, how can we use this moment to get the urgent next steps needed? What actions do we need to see, especially at COP26? And how can we better communicate this science so that more people understand it and we can leverage that to demand action and justice from the leaders?
Great questions, Mitzi. Who would like to take this on? We've got some hands up. Okay, I can see Aranaba. You'd like to take this on. Let's go. Can you hear me?
No, I didn't have my hand up.
Okay.
I think.
Sorry.
I think it's Laura.
Yeah, I just raised my hand right now.
Sorry, I just saw you, Laura.
No, I just raised it now, so don't worry. Thank you very much for the question. It's of course a crucially important question. And the thing that I would like to point out is that, of course, this is just the first, the report that was released from the Ipcc was from Working Group 1 on the physical basis. So it was not focused on how to reduce emissions. It didn't focus on mitigation, although these scenarios included assumptions on from the shared socioeconomic pathways, and they all were assumptions on economic growth, some higher, some lower. The current report doesn't deal with this. This should come, the how to achieve emissions reduction should come with the report from the third working group on climate change mitigation. So obviously that report is going to review the literature on this issue, but it's very clear just from the composition of the chapters that were published, not the chapters, but the titles of the chapters. And there has been some movement over time. That report is including a chapter on accelerating the transition, including or in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's going to be an important contribution. It's going to look at areas beyond GDP and economic growth. And there's also a really important chapter, also a new chapter for the Ipcc Working Group 3 on demand services and social aspects of mitigation. So in terms of what can be done now is, yes, as you're saying, this is code red, as we talk about in this report, this should cause everyone, civil society, investors, governments to move much faster and put in place policies and initiatives that start bending the curve, not just in a few countries around the world. In Europe, we've seen that even with consumption-based accounting, emissions are coming down, although of course at a rate that is nowhere near enough. But at this point, we need to emphasize that we have a big report coming up that is going to tackle the what to do for mitigation, or review the evidence and what we know about what to do about mitigation. But we need to consider the world as a system in which we cannot separate, a just transition from health, from ecosystem services. So I think just, a quick reminder that we're going to have more to chew on in a few months.
Thank you, Professor Anadon. I can see Dr. Christopher McGlade would like to answer as well.
Thanks very much, Adi, and thank you for the question. I would just perhaps like to give three kind of quite concrete things which I think we need to see happening and potentially coming out of the COP. The first one is on finance, and it's about getting money to where it needs to be. As we heard from Fatima, for example, we need the transition, the reduction in emissions to be a just transition. And a lot of the emissions growth that is likely to happen is going to come from emerging and developing economies. And those countries will need support to make sure that they don't go down a fossil fuel development pathway, they go down a clean energy pathway instead. Making sure we get that finance flowing through is going to be absolutely crucial to getting emissions to come down. The second point is on coal. We saw a big reduction in coal as a result of the pandemic in 2020. However, unfortunately, it's likely to be the case that coal demand increases again in 2021. And that's not acceptable if we are to limit climate change, especially if we want to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So we need to see something very concrete coming out on how are we going to phase out coal-fired power plants, focusing first on the most inefficient coal-fired power plants, and then moving on more broadly to finding alternatives to the use of coal. And finally, I think a thing we need to see is on the recovery packages coming out of the pandemic. There was a lot of talk whenever the pandemic was at the beginning that we can recover better, that it's possible to have a green recovery from the economic impacts of the pandemic. Unfortunately, it looks like the case that a lot of the rhetoric there hasn't really been matched by what we've seen governments putting in place. A lot of the money that governments are pledging is not towards clean technologies, it's towards incumbent technologies or things that are just not going to help us to reduce emissions. So we need to see a much greater focus from governments on making sure that the recovery packages from the pandemic are absolutely focused on reducing emissions.
Thank you for that answer. Mitzi, I hope that was of use to you. I think our next question will come from Matthew Schertz, and he's a journalist at Favura. Matthew, are you there?
Yes.
You just need to unmute yourself, Matthew.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I've heard a couple of times about the need to refreeze the poles, the Arctic and Antarctic, and I don't know what that means. Are there techniques to do that? Can someone comment on that? What is being studied? Is it possible? Thank you.
It's a great question, Matthew, and I think the man to answer this is Sir Dave.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you for the question, Matthew. I think the first thing I want to say is we plan at our next meeting to say quite a lot more about refreezing the poles. Let me just very quickly say the key objective would be to return the Arctic Ocean to the state it's been in for many hundreds of thousands of years, covered by ice, which means that the ice reflects sun away from the area and keeps the North Pole cold, whereas right now, after the polar summer, this has been the most extensive loss of ice there. We see that the North Pole region is now one of the warmest parts of the Northern Hemisphere, and this is disturbing the climate systems around the world. When we say we need to buy time, we need to buy time by finding the methodologies that we could use to see that we recreate an ice covering over the Arctic Ocean. And I think that is going to be something we'll discuss in future meetings. Matthew, do be patient with us. We won't cover it all in one meeting.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm really interested in hearing about as well. It's a fascinating topic and could make a big difference. So our next question comes from Samuel Hook. Samuel Hook, sorry, let's hear your question.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Salimul Haq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University of Bangladesh. And my question is particularly for reactions from Johan Rockstrom and Sir David about the characterization of the sixth assessment report, Working Group 1 report that has just been released, which I am calling the first IPCC report on loss and damage from human-induced climate change, because that's what I believe they've done. They don't use those words because those are highly politically sensitive terminology. But I would ask you to reflect on whether or not I have it right, and whether or not that is something that we need to be talking about at the political level as well. Thank you.
So who have we got for that? I think I can see Sir Dave, you've got your hand up.
I don't want to be dominating this, but let me very quickly say, Salim, that's a great question. We've just had a question from the Philippines, and I think we would recognize that the area of the world most impacted and creating the greatest loss and damage is Southeast Asia. And Bangladesh is bang in the middle of this, but so is the Philippines. The Philippines has suffered the world's most intense hurricane on record in recent years, and we're seeing more and more intense hurricanes impacting around the world. What we understand from this is that the loss and damage, which is a good way of expressing this from human-induced climate change, is simply getting worse virtually year on year, but certainly on an average of every 5 years, we're seeing the loss and damage increasing each year. I believe we are going to have to anticipate that enormous global cities, dynamic cities where an enormous investment has taken place, such as Jakarta, such as Calcutta, may not be livable as we move forward in time. Now, that is a sort of unimaginable loss and damage future, because the amount of investment in these 15 million plus cities is really enormous. So I think I fear, however, going back to the discussion earlier on, that I don't want this to sound apocalyptic with no solution. We are trying to put forward solutions, and these have to be systemic, carefully thought through solutions, which also can get political backup and financial backup. And that's really our objective in the CCAG at the moment.
Thank you, Sir Dave. And can we have a quick comment from Professor Rockstrom?
Yes, okay, so yeah, great question, Salim, and great to see you. I agree with you. I think this can be definitely defined as a loss and damage assessment. It's quite remarkable, actually. I mean, you know the IPCC so well. The real loss and damage assessment in Work Group 2 is yet to come. And the physically based working group is already loaded with damage. And I think the most remarkable part of the Working Group 1 report with regards to damage is that the conclusion, just like Sir David points out, is not only that the severity of extreme events is now well attributed to human-caused global change, but also the frequency is increasing. And this is something we've not been able to conclude previously. And it's remarkable that Working Group 1 talks about commitment times over centuries, irreversible changes of sea level rise of 2 meters at already 1.5 degrees Celsius. So of course that loss and damage is already at this time step in this decade for centuries to come. And then on top of that, all the irreversibilities that the Working Group 1 is now bringing up as real risks. So yes, I mean, Mitzi is right. It's not as if anything new really is in this assessment, because the scientific frontier has been pointing in this direction for a long time, but it's comprehensively gathered in the most authoritarian way we've ever seen. So in that sense, it really is significant.
Thank you, Professor Rockstrom. I think from my experience as a journalist, one of the more powerful ways, Salim, to get people to understand the nature of what we're facing is those stories, is the stories of how people are being affected directly. And I went to Bangladesh and saw the impact of the floods there. It's incredible. And I think when people see how it affects individuals, I think that really just empowers them to want to make a change. I hope your questions were answered there and you're satisfied. Thank you very much for the question. Now we're going to move on to Morgan Phillips, co-director of the Glacier Trust. Morgan, take it away.
Thanks, Adi, and thanks for the opportunity to join today. So my question is about the mitigation scenarios that the IPCC looks at when it does these reports. The IPCC continues to only assess mitigation scenarios that have a built-in assumption that governments will always prioritise GDP growth. And yet governments such as New Zealand are looking at whether they should prioritise well-being of society and people instead. So why doesn't the IPCC present mitigation scenarios that highlight what might be possible if global North governments abandon GDP growth as their core economic objective and instead adopt post-growth economic policies that would make the mitigation challenge that bit easier?
Wow, there is a very fascinating question. Who would like to take this one on then? See a few smiles. Got a hand up for Professor Key.
Well, maximizing GDP growth is really a global practice in most of the countries, and China is probably the most typical one in the last, at least in the last 2 decades. And not only maximizing GDP growth overall, but also China has come up with basically a system of maximizing GDP by encouraging the local government to do so, to engage a competition. So those local government leaders who can maximize their local GDP, they can get promoted. This is what happened in most of the last 2 decades. Just a couple of years later, and China changed the narrative and also changed the concept. Now, as a national strategic move, China is no longer encouraging the maximization of GDP, using the words transitioning from the speed, the growth-oriented, the speed-oriented growth to the quality-oriented growth, and also to promote the idea of the so-called eco-civilization. In the same time, China is making the use of so-called green GDP, just incorporating environmental damages, and also the ecosystem service and ecosystem goods and services into the calculation of green GDP. We have seen some of the leading cities, like in Shenzhen, in Guangdong province, is made a pilot city to experiment a different way of doing so. This is a very, very difficult transition, going from the speed priority to the quality growth priority. But we have seen this is taken very seriously in a large economy like in China. And this is taken very seriously at the very top. And last year, when the president made the announcement about achieving carbon neutrality by 2060, we can see the local government and also the leading companies. They are making their own plan for carbon peak and carbon neutrality. They're doing so in a way that they're again competing for this, who can come to the carbon neutrality first, and to such an extent that the central government came out at the end of last month and said, we're not making this as a campaign style, rather this is a long-term transition and we have to make it right. So what we can see, this is some economies, the bigger economies like in China and smaller economies like in New Zealand, you just mentioned, they're moving into that direction, but we want to see this moving faster. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Yi. Dr. Aranaba, I can see you've got your hand up as well.
I wanted to make a very quick point. The issues that Professor Chia is talking about is something that will take some time for various countries to arrive at their own kind of alternative. The reason GDP survives is not because it's the best measure, it's kind of the simplest measure that everyone connects with. So what's going to be the alternative to this. Either we come up with a simpler measure than GDP, that displaces GDP. Remember, it wasn't a measure of progress even 150 years ago. So either we can go down that path, or we can look at incentives. Now, are there incentives that then nudge businesses, societies, countries onto a different pathway? Professor Chiye talked about some of the issues. India's 15th Finance Commission, which determines the flow of money between, or the share of revenue that's shared between the central and state governments, has a provision of the environmental performance of some of the states as one of the factors that will determine how much money then goes to state governments. Bhutan has experimented with its happiness index. Just a few months ago, UNDP brought out its flagship Human Development Report, adjusting what was already a GDP-defying measure, the HDI, the Human Development Index, and adjusting it for what it called the planetary adjusted HDI. The question is, how can any of these measures then be used as an incentive structure to say money will not flow if you don't follow X, right? Or you will be taxed more if you follow Y, right? Because I think the quest for looking for a simpler measure than GDP might take us longer than using what we have and leveraging that as a public policy tool to drive the incentives and the disincentives in the directions that we desire.
Thank you, Dr. Aranaba. I think that's a real key sort of point that you made there, finding a new way other than GDP and economic incentives. Constant growth perhaps is not the right way for us. Hope that your question was answered there, Morgan, and you feel satisfied. Thank you for that question.
I would like to hear if they feel that the IPCC should be looking at scenarios of post-growth when they look at how we can mitigate climate change.
I mean, listen, we will. There will be opportunities to come back to this question in the future, but we've got so many more questions. We would like to move on. But if you'd like to come on next month's panel and live stream and ask that question, we will definitely take it on. Thank you, Morgan. So our next question is Bridget McKenzie from Bridget McKenzie, Director of Climate Museum UK.
Hello. So I am one of many thousands of cultural and creative practitioners who have declared a climate and ecological emergency. We have a community of practitioners, and we stand ready, to mediate and engage with people around the work of the IPCC and your group. So what can we do for you? We stand ready, we're willing, and we want to know what you most require of us. What do you wish we could do for you?
Wow, thank you, Bridget. We like that. That's amazing. I think I can see Lorraine, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, this is really exciting to hear, and I really think that the cultural sector has an enormous role to play. And I think because some of the research around how we engage people with climate change shows that climate change can often seem very abstract and remote for people. But through art, for example, we can connect with people's emotions, and that provides a more immediate and powerful way to potentially shape people's behavior than reason or facts alone. And so we can sort of create that sort of more visceral connection with climate change, which we might not otherwise have. And I think spaces like museums, for example, and other sort of cultural spaces can help people step outside of their everyday life and habits and enable them to reflect either on their own or as part of groups, and develop a sort of maybe potentially an empathy for nature or for people that might be affected by climate change. So I think there's a really important opportunity there to engage with people that they don't necessarily have otherwise. I think one of the things though that we need to do is to recognize that potentially that engagement that's created through that medium isn't always translated into behavior change. So you might create this kind of very powerful emotional engagement. People really want to do something, but actually they find it's very difficult to do anything. So if there's some way in which, as part of that experience, they're given information about kind of this is what you can do, or these are the policymakers that you can lobby, or these are, have a conversation with somebody else to inspire them to take climate change action. So using that opportunity as far as you can to kind of take people on that step about what they can do, I think would be one other thing that you can do. But you're already starting to do lots of very exciting things, so well done.
Thank you, Professor Whitmarsh. Dr. Tero.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your offer. A few weeks ago, the IPCC chairs met with some of the artist organizations in Northern Europe to ask the same question. And they came up with an alliance that's currently being built on how visual artists, theater people, cinema, and others are then able to communicate the findings of the upcoming and recently released IPCC Working Group 1 report. So there's already a coalition in place, and one of the founding principles for this dialogue between IPCC and the arts and the cultural alliance here brings on the idea of wisdom and cultural interpretation of the rather technical things that are spewing out of the machinery, so to speak. So we have to find a way to put a human face and also compassion, cultural interpretation, and significance to the barrage of information that is coming out on the climate change file. And that's why the cultures, the arts, and interpretations of those things, for example, theater plays, puppet theater, visual arts, whatever the means are of utmost significance, because the reports won't give meaning. It's actually the arts in many ways that catch the attention and the deeper levels of engagement of what goes on. And that's why I'm happy to link you with the people involved in the IPCC chairs and the artistic community that's currently having that. And to conclude, one of the venues where this will be prominently featured will be the Venice event next year with the large art gathering there. So that's partly underway, and thank you for your generous offer.
Thank you, Dr. Tero Mustonen, for that answer. And Bridget, I think everyone here is, we're really happy for that offer, and thank you for that great question as well. I think we are going to move to our final question, and this is from Lucy Blackiston, co-founder of Shit You Should Care About. Lucy, are you there? Lucy, I'm afraid Lucy's not there, but I will quickly read Lucy's question. And it's from a professional perspective, why do people choose to deny that climate change either isn't real or isn't happening? I mean, that's a question that we all face all the time, and it's pretty frustrating. I can see Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, you have your hand up. Would you like to take this on?
Yes, because we've done a bit of work on climate denialism and skepticism and tracked it over time, and it is declining, but we still see, to some extent, there are people that still do deny climate change is real, it's happening, and that it's human caused. And I think the reason that they do that is because they find the solutions threatening in general, and either that it doesn't align with their core values or their ideology, or maybe their lifestyle, that they think this is about sacrifice, giving things up that they care about, or at the sort of organizational level, maybe it doesn't align with what, corporate interests and what they think is good for their company potentially. So what we need to do basically is it's not about kind of giving people more science or facts. We've found that doesn't really work to counter denialism very well. Because people can always find some sort of tiny bit of disagreement or uncertainty and exploit that. Actually, it's about reframing to focus on why this isn't necessarily threatening, as in terms of the solutions to tackle climate change, actually there are real opportunities, as we've heard about, lots of co-benefits in terms of economic prosperity, green jobs, as well as improving well-being and health of communities as well. So I think focusing on those co-benefits, that things that actually will seem much less threatening and actually reframe it as opportunities, is one way that we can overcome some of that denial.
Thank you, Lorraine. I see Professor Mark Maslin. Would you like to have a go at this one as well?
Oh, certainly. I was going to add that we have to think about there are two different types of denial. The first one, I call it honest deniers. These are normal people who just don't have time to think about the science or anything like that. And those are people where I think the cultural sector is really important. Really important figures such as you, Ade, really adds to the way that people can trust and actually think about climate change. And I think also when we change the voice, as Lorraine has said, we talk about optimism, we talk about positive solutions and improving things. And so that deals with the honest deniers, people that just haven't really had the opportunity to think about it deeply. But we also have the dishonest ones. And I think we really have to tackle these. These are people who are paid lobbyists, they are from the fossil fuel companies, they are from particular spectrum of politics who don't want the status quo to change. They fear it, they worry about it. And I think that's really important. We need to tackle that head on and actually, A, show from the science that they're wrong, B, show that actually sometimes their understanding of that perhaps climate change threatens their political views is incorrect. I mean, as I always say, the atmosphere does not care what color, badge, or political party you vote for. And I think this is something that's really important. There are solutions to climate change on the left, the middle, and the right. And I think that's something we have to push, which is people are absolutely entitled to their political opinion. And if they happen to be very right-wing, that's fine. But guess what? There are brilliant solutions on the right wing of the political spectrum to deal with climate change and emissions. So I think we need that balancing act between dealing with the dishonest deniers, but also then support and nurture the honest deniers and actually bring them into the knowledge base that we all have.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's a great place for us to stop today. It's been really good conversation and very enlightening. So thank you to our CCAG members and to everyone that asked excellent questions, as well as all of you, wherever you've tuned in from to watch today's meeting. Your support is much appreciated. If you want to learn more about the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, you can find more information on the website at ccag.earth. You can also follow the group on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can send any questions you may have for CCAG on their social media pages too. Thank you once again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at the next meeting on Thursday, the 30th of September. Together, we can make a difference. Take care.
Bye. The situation with climate change is clear. The crisis is not being managed in the way it needs to be managed at the moment. I am Sir Dave King. I have set up a Climate Crisis Advisory Group. The group represents the international experts on climate change to be available to the public, to policymakers, and to the media around the world. We need action now. What we as humanity do over the next 5 years will, in my view, determine the future of civilization.